Hi guys, happy Friday. It's Friday. It's Friday. Not like it really matters, but it's Friday. Happy Friday. I hope most of you, if not all of you, have listened to yesterday's chapter because it was intense. We are back to Peter now, so we will find out on Monday what's going to happen with Peter's dad being right next to Pax. But for today, we are back to Peter. We left off where Peter and Bolla got into a pretty in-depth conversation about their pasts and their families. So we pick up today with chapter 16, Peter. That's enough. The words, along with Bolla's hand on Peter's shoulder, were a welcome relief. His foot throbbed, his shoulders ached, and his armpits were so chafed that they were bleeding. 2 days of boot camp Bolla, the secret name he'd christened the torture sessions in which he crutched uphill, dragged himself over stony ground on his elbows, and pitched mountains of hay balanced on one foot, had worn him out. He swung around to face the cabin, suddenly not even sure he could make it that far. But above the roof of the cabin, the hills were veiled with rain clouds. Night was coming. He thought of Pax, wet and cold. I could keep going. No, you'll undo the good if you push too fast. Peter nodded and took a step towards the cabin. But Bolla shook her head. Not yet. She pointed to the barn. The third condition. The barn seemed impossibly far away. Peter looked back at the cabin. He wanted to fall into that hammock. He planted his crutch tips in a deliberate show. What is it? Nothing much. You're going to work some puppets for me. Marionettes. That sound too hard? Marionettes? I don't get it. You know what they are. Sure. He pictured the only ones he'd ever seen up close. Punch and Judy characters with long chins and sharp noses at a street fair when he'd been a little kid. Dead-eyed and skeleton-y as starving rats. The puppeteer had jerked them across the stage in twitchy rushes that had left him with nightmares for weeks. What about them? Bolla eyed him for a moment before answering. Another true piece of myself I recovered. I remembered that I'd made some marionettes for my little nieces when I was a teenager. I remembered how much I loved carving the wood. She pulled 2 scarves from her overalls and handed them over with a sigh. Wrap those hand grips. You're still hanging off the crutches. Take the weight on your palms, child. Spread it to your arms, even when you're just standing there. Bolla's unexpected kindness undid Peter. One minute, she'd be barking at him for a dozen pull-ups or shooting her fingers at his face, warning him not to get too close. It was comfortable that way, like home. But the next minute, she'd rub her salve into his aching shoulders, or sand the splinters off his crutches, or drop her chores to fix him a mug of hot chocolate, and he'd realize how much care she was putting into making him strong and mobile, and he felt guilty. He felt guilty now, winding the soft cloth around the hand grips, so he told her what he figured she wanted to hear. Your nieces must have been really happy to get such great presents, but he doubted it. Those nieces of hers had probably stuffed those rat skeleton-y, dead-eyed puppets right into the trash the first night they'd gotten them. No bad dreams. Bolla shrugged, but Peter could tell she was secretly pleased by his words, and his guilt eased. He arranged his weight on his sore palms and followed her to the barn. In the doorway, he paused to draw in the cool air. It smelled of wood and hay and linseed oil and varnish. All good scents, Peter thought, separating them out. And really good together. He swung inside. Bolla crossed to the opposite wall, the one draped in burlap. Peter hung back. That wall had unnerved him the first day. She pulled the material aside and he nearly lost his balance, as though what he saw had hit him with the physical force. The puppets, marionettes, he could see now that they were marionettes hanging off the wall, were spookily realistic, and yet like nothing he'd ever seen. He stepped closer and found his voice. Their eyes. My grandmother's jewelry. She had a long jet necklace. The pupils are filled with those beads. They flash in the light, make my friends seem alive. Peter fell silent again, and Bolla didn't disturb him as he studied the creatures hanging in front of him. 5 were human, a king and a queen, a child, a pirate or sailor, and a sorceress. The rest animals. All the heads were wooden, nearly human-sized and huge-eyed, but the bodies were of a wild variety of materials. A tortoise was shelled with a green and orange gourd. Pinecone bracts formed a serpent's scale, and feathers. Almost all the puppets wore an assortment of feathers as hair or hairdresses, or cloaks or breeches. Looped neatly over pegs beside each marionette was an array of dowels and paddles, strung together with thin black cord. In the center of the wall hung what Peter guessed was the largest puppet, covered by a separate piece of cloth. Bolla removed it, and he gasped. The great bird's wings were magnificent, probably a good 5 feet at full span. Hundreds of dark feathers gracefully overlapped each other in perfect rows, the tips painted red as if licked with fire. Bolla lifted it from its perch and carried it over to Peter. Most of the others are head and shoulder puppets, but this one needs to fly. I jointed him at the elbow. When he soars, you can almost feel the wind. Go ahead, you can touch him. Peter reached out. His fingertips stroked a sleek feathered shoulder. Then the sharp wooden beak painted a bright gold. The bird's eyes glittered huge and black. He dropped his hand. So what do I have to do with this? Bolla motioned to the hay bales. May as well sit down. I'm going to begin at the beginning. Peter sank onto a bale of hay, grateful for the rest. He watched as Bolla hung the great bird back up. She pulled a small book from a niche in the wall, then came and sat beside Peter with it cradled in her hands. I killed someone. She looked up. Peter wasn't quick enough to cover his shock. She heaved a sigh, thick with disgust. No matter what Diabloman lines they feed you about learning trades and reaching your potential, you're there to kill people. Kill or be killed. That's the contract in war. That wasn't true. His father, for example. You won't be fighting, right? Peter had pressed. His father had laughed and said no. He'd just be doing pretty much what he did as a civilian, laying wires. Peter didn't bother correcting Bolla, though, because the look on her face was so wrecked. You killed someone. I probably killed a lot of people, or at least contributed to their deaths, but this one I saw. After, I had to search his body. We were trained to look for weapons, anything that we could use. I dropped to my knees. I had to touch him, looking for those weapons. I remember being shocked at the feel of him. I was a medic, but still I half expected him to be plastic, not real. The way they taught us to think of the enemy in our training. But of course he was. He was warm. It was cold out, and he was giving off warmth. As if his life was steaming out of him, and I was touching him without his permission. I'd murdered him, but what bothered me was that he had lost the right to say yes or no about what happened to him. You probably think that's crazy, don't you? Peter's mouth had gone dry. He didn't know what to say. And then suddenly he thought of the kind-eyed therapist, and he did know. That must have been very hard for you. Bolla looked at him with a surprised relief on her face. She nodded. Suddenly I was desperate to know who he was, where he'd come from, what he cared about, who loved him. His mouth was open, as if he might have wanted to speak to me. I realized something then, that even though he was a man, even though he was a different race, even though he had grown up in a different country, we might have had a lot in common. Important things, more important than which army had drafted us. 2 but not 2, but I'd killed him. So now we would never know. I searched his body, not for weapons, but for clues to who he'd been. Bolla went silent, her face so devastated that Peter wanted to look away. And this. Bolla lifted the book, The 7 Voyages of Sinbad, part of the Arabian Nights series, in his pocket. He'd carried it into war, so it had to have meant something. An old copy, so probably it had been his favorite as a boy. Sinbad was brave, so maybe he thought it brought him courage, or maybe he just wanted to remember that once he had been a little boy and he had read books and felt safe. A page was bookmarked, the story of how Sinbad escapes from the rock's nest. I figure that story helped him believe that one day he'd escape too, to get back home. Bolla got up. She lifted the great winged puppet off the wall again. The rock. This bird could snatch up elephants in its talons. Look at it. She carried the bird back to Peter and turned its beak to face him. Its gaze was so fierce that Peter shrank back. What do I have to do with this? He asked again. That book was so important to that soldier that he'd carried it to war. I'd figured since I'd taken his life, I owed him something. I owed it to him to tell the story that meant so much to him. I carved all these puppets, and I've been telling the story of Sinbad escaping from the rock here in my barn for nearly 20 years. Bolla handed the control apparatus to Peter. And now, finally, I'm going to get to see what it looks like. So, that was deep. It was sad. That was just deep. Bolla had to kill someone in war, and she's obviously struggling with that fact. And yeah, so the third condition that we didn't know what it was before now, the third condition is that he is going to put on the play for her to watch now, because she's been doing it in her barn by herself to herself for 20 years in honor of the man that she killed in war. So that's very interesting. I like this relationship that Bolla and Peter have now. Like, they started out like this and now they're like this, and I like it. Guys, looking at the book, we're actually more than halfway done now. We've read this much and we only have this much to go, and it kind of makes me sad. That means it's about to get really, really, really good. Chapter 17 on Monday, we go back to PAX, and it's a good length, which means that there's a lot of action. Oh, I can't wait. I want you to leave your predictions in the comment section below about what you think is going to happen with Pax. Also, you can leave predictions about what you think is going to happen with the relationship between Peter and Bolla. Remember, his initial plan is to leave before she said it was allowed. He's supposed to stay there, I think, 6 weeks? And he's like, nah. In his mind, he's like, that's not happening. Do you think he's actually going to follow through with leaving? Do you think, I don't know, what do you think is going to happen? I miss you guys. I love you. I hope you have a great weekend. We'll take a 2-day break from our book, and I will see you again on Monday. Take care, wash your hands, be nice to your parents. You do not need to do your work this weekend unless you just want to, but there's really nothing to do. Yeah, read a book, go play. It's beautiful. Bye, guys. Love you.